Hey everybody, welcome back. Good to see you. Daily Time with God on this Monday. I think it's also, is it President's Day today?
Yep.
Is that a thing? Yep. So glad you are joining us. Hope you're having a good day already. We are going to do a little bit of a different topic today. So over the last couple of weeks, we have been doing a special focus as well on world religions. And so hopefully if you've been able to join us for that, that's been helpful. If you missed any of those or you want to go back to any of the old series, you can do it on our YouTube page, which is linked wherever you found this. Feel free to check that out. It was a great couple weeks. Thanks for all the ways you guys kind of rolled up your sleeves and dug in. And I was like, oh man, it's going to be so cool. We're going to just get back to studying some Bible passages together. And then a story that had been kind of percolating a little bit over the course of the last few months kind of came to a head a little bit this weekend. So there's a famous evangelist, apologist guy that actually passed away this fall. Probably maybe one of the greatest apologists that we've ever seen. And there had been some accusations made against him from women related to sexual misconduct. And I think that we'll get into this, but I think a lot of organizations, unfortunately, have kind of been pushing this type of stuff underground a little bit. But RZIM, which is the ministry that he founded, they did an investigation and said, we're going to make all the results public. And so they did that this weekend. And unfortunately, not only did the accusations that had been brought get validated, but actually they discovered some more that had never been made. So devastating, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think, why does this keep happening, right? Ravi Zacharias is not the first. Unfortunately, he will not be the last of Christian leaders that we see kind of flame out through one way or another. It is not without victims. And so we're certainly thinking about these women today who some of them, didn't even intend on having their story told. And now, even if their names aren't in the report, they're getting, communicated all around, whether people know it's them or not. So anyway, we're going to study some Bible passages about leaders in general and kind of what is this call on us? What is the stewardship? What does this look like? And I would say this is uniquely around leadership in church world, but I would say it also has to do with what it looks like to follow Jesus and lead well. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we do, we're talking a little bit about kind of just in general, maybe who in your life have you learned the most from? So Lisa, you got somebody?
Well, I've had some amazing women in my life, actually, and they came in at different stages and in different places. And it was interesting because there are ladies that have come in and then have cycled out of life. But I would have to say some of those mentors have been pivotal in who I am today. Outside of that, probably my parents.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I definitely can think of some mentors in my life. I had a professor in undergrad named Dr. Sauer who was super influential for me personally. I was also in some classes with them that were really helpful, and some men growing up that really invested in me. I think about a guy named Charles Keel, who moved to Ohio to help plant this church that I went to, but he was a good old boy farmer. He built his house himself. He was tough, but his Bible was well worn and he loved Jesus. And it was just a different picture of what it looked like to follow Jesus than I'd seen before. And I learned a ton from him. So anyway, so for you guys, as you're watching, just drop in maybe who in your life do you feel like you kind of learned the most from? And as we all sort of work to stay warm today, it's up to -2. It's going to get to 28 today. What are you going to go to the pool?
Yeah, I mean, it's just downright balmy,
My assistant, Natalie, I'm not saying this for your benefit, Lisa. Lisa knows this, but Natalie does not live here. She lives in Houston, outside of Houston. And so she texted me this morning, whatever, temperature it was. And she's like, our power's out and I'm sitting by the fire. And she's like, I don't think I'm going to get a lot done today. I was like, that sounds like snow in Texas. I remember when we lived there for grad school, not in Houston, but in Fort Worth. It was literally if someone said the word snow, they shut everything down. So I can't imagine with a legit storm down there, what it's like. I'm sure it's crazy. So
it is. I mean, it shuts the city down because you just don't know what to do.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, let's say good morning to some folks. Our executive producer, Crystal, is here. What's up? Good to see you, Crystal. Greg, what's up, buddy? Good to see you. Pete, patience in choosing joy and kindness, looking at each day as a gift. I have the tendency to get aggravated with what I don't have, but in reality, I have everything I've ever wanted. That's awesome, man. And I mean, I think for all of us, God's given us what we need for today, right? And so how do we live with an understanding of that? And then Peggy, good morning. Good chilly morning, all. Absolutely, for sure. Gloria, good morning. My dad, I find myself, quoting him to my son. That's fun. I'm sure your son appreciates that. Jenny, what's up? Good morning, friends. Stay warm. I've learned the most important stuff from my parents, especially my dad. My high school students have educated me about all the other things. I bet that's true. You get to
He's not wrong.
Stay current for sure. And then Greg, agree with Lisa, my parents and favorite aunt. That's cool. Look at that. An aunt made the list. And Fred, good morning. Good to see you, sir. His dad. That's awesome. Linda, good morning. For Linda, it was a former boss, Tim. For Steve, his uncle, Bob. That's cool. I had a boss in high school named Jim Garrity, and I worked at a Radio Shack, which were things that existed. And he was like a really nice guy and really did. I mean, he was kind of curmudgeon-y, but like I learned a ton from him. So Pete, who maybe my dad, well, he was a good dad. I'm doing things much differently with my kiddos, leading them by Jesus' example. Well, I think, for most of us, we have to take in life pieces from people and things that we learn from, even though maybe because nobody is wholesale right. Nobody's wholesale good. Like it's going to take filtering for sure. Dan, my grandfather taught me everything. Wish he were still here to guide me today and see the man I've become. Well, he'd be very proud of you, Dan. I am certain of that. That's an awesome legacy, man. Ron, good morning. I would say my wife. That's cool. Look at that. That's first wife reference. It's not even Valentine's Day anymore. Way to go, Ron. Crystal, Lisa, I have learned more from you in the last 3 years than anyone else. You're such a blessing to everyone around you. Look at that. Isn't that sweet?
That is sweet.
That's awesome.
I like Crystal.
And we got Dux joining us on YouTube. What's up, Dux? Good morning. Yeah. Good to see you with the Batman going on there. Look at that. That Batman looks kind of scared. And then Leslie, good morning. My family for sure, especially my grandma, who always gave me great advice. She's gone now, and I miss her every day. I'm so sorry. I hope kind of strolling down memory lane, right, reminds us of some of the things that we can think back to and maybe some people that have influenced us. There's a really good benefit in remembering not just what we learned, but who we've learned it from, connecting some of those memories. Jenny, favorite dadism on this cold day that he taught me repeatedly, and I quoted yesterday. Do you know the difference? Do you know what the difference is between -10 and -20 degrees? Not a darn thing. That's awesome. That's good. And Dan, there's still a Radio Shack in Watkins, about 20 minutes from E-Hills. Look at that. There you go.
You should take a stroll down memory lane.
Yeah, I could go back to Radio Shack just to see why on God's green earth they're still open. Jan, good morning. Good to see you. Gary, we have been married. Oh, this is her husband, Gary. That's awesome. We've been married for 56 years. So we've learned a lot together. I've learned a lot from Gary too. That's awesome. Look at that. Is so sweet. 56 years. Congratulations, guys. Leslie, Crystal, I guess I agree 100%. She has been a great mentor to me for the last 5 years. There you go. See? If you guys keep going, maybe we'll make Lisa cry again.
I was going to say, I feel the tears.
That's awesome. Well, hey, obviously this highlights, that there are people in our life that can make a huge difference. There are people in our life that can really impact us for the good. And then unfortunately, hopefully it's none of the people on the list that we just gave, but unfortunately, if you've been around life for a while, at some point, somebody on your list of influential people in your life is going to let you down. And hopefully it's not as catastrophic as what we're going to talk about today with Ravi. But I just did that a little bit to remind us that we all have people that there is a little bit of emotional exposure in our connection to them if we're not careful, to make sure we remember that they're just people too. So anyway, we're going to get started. But before we do, Lisa, would you pray for us?
Yep. God, thank you for bringing us together on a chilly Denver morning. I pray that you would really guide our conversation this morning. This is a topic that is so easy to just brush under the rug and move past, but we are seeing the need for this conversation more and more. Lead us and guide us, give us wisdom, and help us to remember that without you, we really can't do anything. We can't be good people. And so we need you and we need your guidance. We love you and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So if you joined us a little bit late, just a reminder what we're talking about today. Ravi Zacharias is a famous apologist who passed away last year. And kind of over the course of his final years, there were some accusations that started to get made towards him from a group of ladies. And as those got made, there was pushback, just a bunch of resistance towards them, especially obviously from Ravi. And the organization, RZIM, actually did an investigation and then released that investigation and with it a statement. And unfortunately, not only were the accusations that were made accurate, they were even worse than they thought. And there were more of them than had been reported. And so I don't it's not really about us talking about Ravi. Like, it's so sad. And I am, my heart breaks, not just for RZIM and the organization and all that stuff. I think they've handled it as best you can. On the other side, right, we'll talk a little bit about what can be done proactively in Christian organizations and churches. But my heart really breaks for those victims that you have ladies that, oftentimes in situations like this, the way victims will share the tension that they feel is, I don't feel like I can say anything because it's going to make all this stuff that God is doing through this person not happen anymore. And so I just need to bury it, or maybe I did something that invited this. And this kind of like just internal victim blaming that happens within spiritual abuse that often is a part of sexual abuse by Christian leaders. And so really, my heart breaks. I think this is not the only one of these. This is not the first or the last. Unfortunately, we are watching a pattern of this take place more and more and more often. And, here's the deal. If there were 30 of these over the last year, we would be absolutely awestruck. We wouldn't even be able to know what to do. And there hasn't been, but that would be a small infinitesimal fraction of all ministry leaders. So it doesn't mean that this is just everywhere. Every ministry leader is doing it. But every time there's a reminder that this exists with the kind of like influence and control, I think it's a reminder to go, if this can happen with Ravi Zacharias, I'm an idiot if I don't think this can happen with me. Like, I'm just not paying attention.
And to piggyback on what you said, a lot of people don't come forward because there is just immense shame that goes along with that. And so, I think we're going to look at the leaders side of it, but just remember that there are victims in this story and in all of these situations that are just tragic. And for these people and their families, it's just awful. And I was reading the article that you posted, the letter to the church that RZIM came out with, and well written. And at the very end, or close to the end, they remind people that he had a family too. I mean, his wife is still alive and his children. And I mean, this when we talk about that, our actions have these ramifications that affect other people. This is it right here. So.
And I think what's difficult is like figuring out in the midst of culture how we have this conversation, because it basically feels like if we widen it a little bit, obviously what happened with Ravi, he's gone now, right? Like, there's not like the idea of like, how do we bring justice for these women? We trust God with that justice, but there is no way in which, kind of human justice systems are going to deliver that for them. And so I think that's a heartbreaking reality that's a part of this unique situation. But I also think like we have to wrestle with the fact of what are the circumstances in which, not even just for Christian leadership, but we usually use the term cancel culture, that it does not take all of this for someone to get canceled. Certainly not for someone in ministry. Like, Lisa or I are literally one statement away on any given day on a broadcast like this from just not existing in ministry world anymore. Like, we say the wrong thing and we are completely gone, deleted. And so how do you live in a world where like the moral center is changing and you have to perfectly adhere to it? That puts a lot of pressure on people. And so how do we wrestle with that as well? So anyway, we're going to look at a few passages here real quick. And then there was this tweet that a buddy of mine sent to me that we'll look at from a pastor down in Houston, just of his observations in church world of why this keeps happening, and maybe ways to counter it kind of in those. So we'll do that. As you have prayer requests or ways that maybe even for you, like I think there's something deeply important about how we look out for this in our own lives, whether you serve as a volunteer, whether you have leadership at work, whether you're a leader in your home, like you have an opportunity to learn from these principles as well. And then just hopefully for you, when the next one of these headlines comes up, you can remember, oh, I'm praying for victims. I'm praying for the people that were affected. In most cases, the perpetrator is still alive. I'm praying for them and their family. I'm praying that God would bring them to repentance, that he would change their heart, right? Like, what does it look like for us to just reorient our perspective there? So Acts chapter 20, verse 28, Acts of the Apostles, written about the early church. And so this is just, I think, a great reminder that we see in the book of Acts for the early church that's obviously relevant to us. And it says, pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his blood. So obviously, we don't want to just make it super shame-inducing. But when we look at this verse in Acts 20, Lisa, what are some things that stand out to you with the way Christian leaders are being kind of challenged and thought about how they lead from this particular verse?
I think it's interesting that Paul writes, pay careful attention, but he says to yourself first, and then to those that you are overseeing. And so, we've talked about how the church is referred to as sheep and the pastor as a shepherd. And you see this language here when he talks about the flock. But, it's kind of like check yourself before you wreck yourself here in Paul's first century language, where it's, hey, you got to make sure that you are in step with the Holy Spirit. Then you can guide those that are in your charge as well.
And I think there is, we always use the metaphor, right, of like you're on the airplane, they say put the mask on yourself before you help somebody else. Like, I think it is really easy in ministry to like subtly shift to where you are giving people around you something you are no longer experiencing. And maybe you've experienced it in the past. And so you can be like, oh, I remember when I had this deep, vibrant connection with Jesus. And so, I think there's this subtle shift that can take place. And you've talked about this, Lisa, out of the book that you've highlighted a few times, where we go from living, working, doing life with, abiding in Jesus, to all of a sudden we do ministry for Jesus. And I think this passage to me is super helpful because where it leans to, right, is it's a reminder that the church isn't ours. And so it doesn't matter what role you're in. One reason that I don't take the title senior pastor, I go by the title lead pastor, is because we have a senior pastor and his name's Jesus. And he loves Eastern Hills way more than I ever could. And he loved Eastern Hills before I ever got here. And he'll love Eastern Hills long after I'm gone. So understanding that is this stewardship of, like everything else we have in life. How do we make sure we are wise stewards of this grace that God has poured out in a specific church? I think that's really, really important, because once it becomes mine and all of a sudden that responsibility is on me, and all of a sudden I become this kind of overseer, which is a synonym in the New Testament for a term called elder, which really was their idea of pastor. And so you put all that together and it becomes a very slippery slope towards, I can't let people know what's really going on in me. I can't really get help. I've got to just keep muscling through. And I think this is a warning to not do that. So, and obviously, as we're studying these passages, if you guys have anything you want to add, ways you've seen this work really well, or pastors that that have done this really well, just drop it in the chat. I would love to be able to hopefully have a thoughtful conversation together about how we handle this. And I would say this is true even if the flock for you is a small group, even if the flock for you is your kids, this idea of what does it look like to pay careful attention to yourself and to them, and remember that like their connection to God is not something that happened because you worked really hard. It's because Jesus died for them. So
yeah, that's good.
And then the next passage we're going to look at, or the next verse, comes from 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16. There are actually 2 letters written to Timothy. 1 Timothy is kind of more organizational. And so Paul is writing about the church at Ephesus and helping Timothy, this young pastor, understand how to best pastor it. 2 Timothy is like a more personal, just Paul to Timothy. And so in 1 Timothy chapter 4, 16, Paul says, keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing, you will save both yourself and your hearers. So obviously there's some similarities between Acts 20:28 and 1 Timothy 4:16. But what stands out to you that's unique or kind of enhances your understanding of this same idea for leaders today?
Well, and you highlighted it, right? We have to, this is the long game. It's not something where you wake up one day and you think, and you say to yourself, okay, today I'm not going to whatever. And then it's just, I'm never going to do that again. It is something that we have to persist in. It's something that is an ongoing thing. For some people, it is moment by moment where it's this constant. Paul at some point describes something in his life as just this thorn in his side where he didn't want it anymore, but God was like, hey, this is the deal. And so it was something that he had to live with. And so how do you have these urges, but you are paying attention to that, and you are then persisting in pursuing Jesus above whatever it is that your fleshly desires are?
And I think that, there's a theological term called perseverance of the saints. Sometimes it's called eternal security. And it's not really meant to be if you do this, then this will happen. It's more like if you're a follower of Jesus, you will endure. Like it's a byproduct of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so this idea of endurance or persisting, that like we will continue to stay faithful to Jesus till the end. I just think that, it's easy to get a good start, and we're going to talk about that. It's easy for, somebody to get a good year, 2 years, or 3 years, right? And we have these bad habits that start to develop, and then over time, those bad habits, right? What does the Bible say? Be sure your sin will find you out. All of a sudden, they start to kind of poke their head up, and they show up in unhealthy ways, and they show up in relationships, and this idea that we can just keep burying that stuff is a weight and a pressure that we were never designed to carry. And I think, unfortunately, when we apply the energy that God would call us to persist in being the right kind of leader, when we apply that energy to image management, when we apply that energy to control and manipulation, all of a sudden, not only are we not doing what God wants us to do, we're using the very energy that he would want us to do that with, and we are circumventing that energy to actually create pain and hurt people. And so whether that's something as overt as what happened with Ravi, or it's more subtle. I was in Seattle when Mars Hill kind of imploded, which is a big church out there. And it wasn't like a big sexual controversy. It was really abusive leadership, and just somebody that was leading without heart. And it breaks your heart because it's not the way that God's called us to live. And then this next verse, John 3:30, he must increase, but I must decrease. What do you see in the current climate of Christian leadership that makes this statement difficult to apply today?
Well, I would say that we have flipped this statement. So this is a statement that John the Baptist made about Jesus. And I would say that in today's culture, we say, I must increase, so he must decrease. Because it's all about me. It's about my success. It's about what I want. It's about what feels good in whatever moment it is that I'm in. And I think we just see this, not just in the church, but we see this everywhere, that it's all about number one. And if Jesus fits into that equation somewhere, neat. But for the most part, it's kind of what's good for this girl.
Right. And I think that there is, I think there's something so pervasive about what I would refer to as celebrity culture. And so, this challenge of like, hey, you aren't just like when I was a kid, even pastors that were like pastors of very large churches, they were not cool. Their face was not on a screen. Like it wasn't getting shared on the internet. It was like the people that went to that church knew them, like that was it. And I think that celebrity culture exists everywhere. Like it's not just in the church, but it definitely exists in the church. And when I'm not judging the heart of anybody. I'm not judging the heart of anybody. But when I look at the kind of the Instagram pastors or the pastors that are big deal on YouTube, I think, man, I wonder what pressure they feel to be the brand. To like all of a sudden make sure that what they're doing looks exactly right and all the things translate correctly online so that the millions of people that are going to watch them can watch them a certain way. And so I think that is a really, really difficult place for us kind of in our moment to go, what is leadership humility look like? It means, I think it's a C.S. Lewis quote, right? True humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less, right? What does it look like to reposition my understanding so that what we talked about this weekend, we reposition God to how big he is, and that allows us to be who we truly are. And then what Paul says is God's strength can be made perfect in my weakness. And this is not just for Christian leaders. This is for any follower of Jesus. This is what it looks like to follow him, that I go, you know what, God, there's not room for both of our egos if mine doesn't shrink, right?
Right.
What does it look like, God, for me to let your power, to let your reign and rule take over in my life? And I think for Christian leaders, this is uniquely difficult. So especially in our moment. And then one more verse to look at together, James 3:1. James is Jesus' half brother, wrote a letter. If you don't know this, he became a follower of Jesus as the Messiah after Jesus was resurrected. Church history tells us that he was not a Christian while Jesus was alive, which makes sense, right? If you got an older brother, that's pretty much what it would take to believe he was God, that he came back from the dead. So it says, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness, right? And so we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but there is an accountability coming for Ravi in eternity that's different. And so there's a judgment or scrutiny coming in eternity for me that will be different. And it's not heaven or hell. It's, hey, what did your faithfulness in Jesus look like on earth? And what will your call in the next life be based on your faithfulness on earth? And so I joke all the time that like the janitors, right, the custodials staff, facilities team, they're going to be like killing it. They're going to be top of the top in heaven. I was having a conversation with somebody last night about one of our partners in Denver who cares for homeless youth, right? And like the people that don't have a whole lot of glamour here, like God's seeing that. And I think sometimes as teachers, we forget, like, even if we've got everybody around us fooled, we will never have God fooled. And there's an accountability that James is saying, like, hey, you should like actually maybe just not teach. Like if you're not willing to let God have this area of your life, you should recognize the accountability that's going to come with that. So
yeah. Well, and Phil, you said it, and it's probably not yours, but with greater responsibility comes greater accountability.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure I didn't come up with that.
And so, and I think it's just so important to remember that we want the responsibilities, we want the title, or we want the whatever. But as you move up, as you ratchet up, there is greater accountability that is required of you. And when we fall away from that, this is kind of what it starts to look like.
Well, and I would say too, even more than just responsibility and accountability, especially when we think about this in terms of Christian leadership. I used to talk about this all the time with parents of kids, of students, is what I call the PAR principle. I mean, I don't call it exists. I did not make this up either. But it talks about how we are designed as humans to grow in equal parts privilege, accountability, and responsibility.
Mm.
And so if all of a sudden one of those grows way higher than another one, or one stays artificially low for a long time, there is really, really dangerous, right? So, and you can think about this. I would have it with like students where mom and dad would give their kid a new car, right? And it was like, oh man, that's an amazing privilege. Like, what is that child accountable to in your home? Like, well, they're accountable to like finish high school. Cool, but like they were accountable to finish high school before you gave them the car, right? So like you gave them an insane more amount of privilege. And in my experience, what lots of privilege without a lot of accountability or responsibility creates is entitlement. And then when you go like, hey, what does a whole lot of accountability and responsibility look like without any privilege? Well, you just train someone to rebel. You train someone to run because they don't sense any love or care from you, right? And so it's just figuring out like, okay, if we're gonna increase, so like we have this conversation even with our kids, like, hey, there's this new thing you get to do. There's this new rite of passage you're going to step into. Here's how you're going to be accountable with this new thing. And here are some responsibilities that will be uniquely yours. We don't ask our 1.5-year-old to contribute around the house the same way we ask our 9 or 11-year-old to. And our 6-year-old is super cute and he knows he can kind of get away with it. He's a baby for a long time. And so, you know, we'll ask him to do something. He's like, oh, I can't. And he's like, and then one of the others will be like, oh, I'll go do it. And we're like, nope. That's his job. And so I think, what does it look like for us to cultivate that, not just in our kids, but in ourselves? And I think nobody's keeping track of that as we get older. And unfortunately, in Christian leadership, if we don't do this, if I don't welcome this into my life, it doesn't happen. I listened to a talk from Andy Stanley about a year before I got to Eastern Hills called The Menace, Myth, and Mayhem of Autonomy. And he talked about how there's a fine line between as free as I can possibly be and prison. And that, there are lots of perks that flow towards you in ministry, lots of little things that people want to do for you and give to you. And I have to be the one to say no, because no one else will do it for me. And, that's why, if you're ever wondering, like, why doesn't Phil go by pastor? Like, why is it like for some people? Like, I remember one of my first months at Eastern Hills, I was walking down to my car because the shuttle had stopped running. And somebody was pulling out of a drive-through and they were like, hey, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I'm going on my car. We parked down there so we can make more room up here. And they're just looking at me funny. And I was like, what? Did you think I had like a car service that drove me around? And I was joking. And they go, yeah. And I was like, oh, dear God, like, what have we done, Lord? And so I just think this understanding of like, we have to put some boundaries on that ourselves. So, Ron,
I've said it before. You asked a question my eye is watering today. Sorry. You asked a question several months ago, but it was like, what are one of those parent things that people or that your parents said to you that just drove you nuts? And mine that I said was, privilege and responsibility go hand in hand. Like I hated when my parents said that. Awesome. And so I try not to say it to my kids, but it's so true. And when we forget that, it just puts us in a bad way.
Yeah, absolutely. Ron says, I've had conversations with others regarding big churches, which can fall into a trap. Though usually I hear friends saying they like small churches. Nothing wrong with that. My answer is I like growing churches as God is adding to his numbers daily. Today's technologies help with sharing his word. Yeah. And I think that there are, I think that there are fantastic and healthy small churches. And I think there are fantastic and healthy large churches. And I think there are toxic, unhealthy versions of both. And so there's a line I heard years and years ago that healthy things grow and growing things change. And so I think, a small church that's 50 people, fantastic, cool. But like, do you baptize anybody this year? Like, are you 50 forever? Like, what does this look like? And so I think figuring out, it can be just as easy to grow complacent in a church of 50 as it can be, take my word for it, in a church of 2000. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. We can't just let numeric growth be the only metric, because then that creates some unhealthy stuff underneath it, but it is a metric. So, Sarah, I've never wanted to be a teacher because I know this verse. Vernon definitely has the gift of teaching, and he follows the PAR principle too. He's a man that invokes peace around just because of his positive attitude. I realize that We've been married since 76. Wow. But it's true. That's awesome. Very good. And then Dom, it's the same when you get the senior roles in companies. If you ever forget who you are and start to buy into the hype that people give you because they want something from you or your favor, you can find yourself way off course in a hurry. Absolutely. I think it's like, it is so easy to drift, and I remember I was listening to a leader. I'm trying to remember. He took over like a massive company and somebody was talking to, I think it was maybe Home Depot or something. And somebody was talking to him about taking over. He's like, hey, you're about to get a lot funnier. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, you're actually not going to get funnier. But like when you step into this role, everybody's going to laugh at your jokes. Everybody's going to like you a little bit more, at least to your face. Right. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that people that aren't happy with me don't come talk to me. They talk about me without me. And so I've had to like learn what is that balance where I want to know the information. I want us to have a direct conversation. I think I'm pretty good at having direct conversations and not getting in people's faces. But I also don't want to create a pattern where it's like, hey, you know how you get Phil's attention if you gossip about him and don't come have the conversation directly. Like, I don't want to create that. And so it's this difficult thing in leadership of like, how do you make sure? And I think a lot of it comes down to people that you have around you that are willing to tell you some of those difficult things. And then being willing to help facilitate the conversation, because some of the things that get said aren't true. Right. And so this idea of like, hey, we can have the conversation, but this person and I will either have to have a conversation directly so that I can dispel these lies, or nothing's going to change because this is just factually not correct. So,
well, and we've talked about it before, but that idea of that's the crowd, right? And then you've got the community, and then you've got the core. And if your core is shallow or fake, there's an inauthenticity that goes in there, then it's not doing the role that it's meant to do, which is to protect yourself from yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's part of the role.
Speaking of Andy Stanley, I know this about Fred, actually. Andy Stanley helped him follow Jesus while he was in Atlanta for 8 weeks back in 2019. That was like kind of the precursor that brought Fred to Eastern Hills. It's awesome. If you don't know this, Andy Stanley leads a church called North Point. It's a very large church, a family of churches in Atlanta. And there's a network of churches called North Point Network, which are kind of churches that say, how do we create churches that make sense to unchurched people? We are a part of that network. And so that's why. I mean, I liked him before that, but we're like in the club. Crystal, it's hard when we're talking about growth metrics, whether it's ministry or healthcare research. I feel like that fine line is easy to cross when people become numbers for numbers' sake. Yeah. Absolutely. Fred, I listened so much in the 80s at his father, Charles. Yeah, absolutely. Charles Stanley just retired, which is insane, actually. Jenny, I would say it's even more than how many people did we baptize, because I feel like that's the starting gate in many ways. I've been in this situation of baptism being the primary metric of a church. I feel like there is more for church growth. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, right now, Lisa's, leading the way on a new environment for us called Cultivate, which is all about kind of this focus for the year of what does it look like to cultivate growth in your own life? Because I think sometimes what we create, especially in churches like Eastern Hills, whether we want to or not, we create these spiritual consumers. And so people that are like, well, I didn't, and you hear things like that worship, I didn't feel it. Or the number of times that, people have said to me, hey, Phil, your preaching doesn't feed me. I don't feel like I'm being fed. And so, like we can have conversations. Hey, is the teaching not biblically accurate? Is there a miss that we need to talk about in what we're doing with worship experience? But like gathered worship is an overflow of individual worship. So when we come together, it should be an overflow of you worshiping throughout the week. If we go back to the temple model where it's like a special place and a special time and special people that gives me this charge up for the week, that is not New Testament Christianity. Similarly, if I understand what happens from a Bible teacher on a weekend as my primary spiritual nourishment, Paul would say that's milk. Like that's supposed to be more milk. The meat of what it means for you to grow spiritually should be happening in times like this, times where you're studying the Bible with other people, times where you're digging in throughout the week. And I think that more and more we have people that are going, I'll give you once or twice a month where I attend a 60-minute service. But like the other billion hours of my month. I'm going to do whatever. So can you give me whatever I need in that moment for the rest of it for me to walk in faithfulness to God? No, I can't. I don't have that capacity. And so there's lots of metrics we talk about, whether that's, what percentage of people are in groups, what percentage of people are serving somewhere, what percentage of people are being exposed to opportunities that we know are going to stretch them. In normal years, that's stuff like missions trips. That's opportunities to serve in compassion ways around our church or around our city, right? Those are all things that matter. It's about how do you create a bigger picture of that. Anything you want to add to that there, Lisa?
Yeah, I would just say Phil and I are not designed to spoon feed people every day. That's just not how it works. And so I've had people say, well, I just can't grow at Eastern Hills. And I'm like, do you have a Bible? Because what we need is in there. What we need to know is how to read it and how to understand it, which is one of the reasons Phil and I are so passionate and excited about what we get to do with Daily Time with God, is to help us learn how to be self-growers, to cultivate growth in our own hearts and in our own lives, because that's how we're going to continue to move forward in our relationship with Jesus, is learning how to do it on our own, not expecting someone else to do it for us. Because then what happens when that person is gone? Or what happens if that person fails, or, something happens? We have to be self-sufficient in the way that we grow, trusting Jesus in that, rather than relying on someone else to do that for us. And just think about all of the great leaders who have led people so well. And then we find out that they were hurting people along the way. Well, then you just lose faith, not only in that leader, but in all leaders. And if your faith was on the foundation of that person, it crumbles real fast.
Well, I mean, this is unfortunately adding to this bigger evangelical problem, right? If it's like, oh, you got to hear my pastor, right? Oh, you got to see my church, right? And we want to be a place that people want to be. We want to create experiences that are helpful for people, that draw them closer to Jesus. Absolutely, we want that. But we want that to be a part of your faith, not your faith itself. And I think that when we make it the majority of our faith, I think the really dangerous thing that happens is all of a sudden we're perpetuating the pressure that can lead towards leaders going, you know what, I can't let people know I'm struggling like this, because this is the expectation on me right now. I feel all this pressure. It all comes to me. And I think one of the things I'm so thankful to Eastern Hills about for my entire time here, I'd never been a lead pastor before I got here. And so I walked in, I was like, I don't know what to do here. I'm not sure how to fix that. And it wasn't like false humility. I'd legitimately never done it before. And so it was leaning on our team, leaning on key parts of our church, leaning on God to go, all right, like, what is it today? What is it we need to do right now? And I think this idea of how do we make sure that we're giving Christian leaders the chance to be human, because they are, whether we're letting them be or not. But if we force them to look like they aren't, that's when oftentimes in what starts out private and becomes public, there are all kinds of unhealthy patterns that get created to sort of like eject out some of that bad behavior. So, Ron, I remember one of my first conversations with you, Phil, and you enlightened me on the fact, thank you, Sunday is one day. We have every day to grow and learn and abide. Absolutely. And it's way better that way. It's way better if you're following Jesus every day than if you're following Jesus on the weekends. You can make it. I promise you, it's so much better. When Jesus says, I've come that you might have life and have it to the fullest, John 10:10, where we get this idea of Jesus makes life better, we're saying like the more you and I abide, and we think about John 15, the more we bear healthy fruit, the more we try to like store up and go, hey, let me put some battery charge back in me, the more we're living according to the temple model that Jesus has freed us from. So something to think about there. And then Dom dropped in a Carey Nieuwhof quote. Carey Nieuwhof is a pastor up in Canada. He's been saying this for years. It is absolutely true. Engagement is the new attendance. Absolutely. For a long time, the idea in church world was if you can get people to attend, then they'll do a bunch of other stuff. If you can get them in the room on the weekend, then they'll join a group, they'll serve, they'll do things of what it looks like for a follower of Jesus. Now it's essentially the opposite, especially with online. And so you may have people that attend physically. We have way more people right now that engage than attend physically because of what's going on with COVID. And so I'm thankful that Eastern Hillers stepped up to that long before any of this started, and thankful that we've continued to do it. But there's always opportunities for us to keep growing, for sure. And then David, I still watch Charles Stanley to this day. He has a way of really driving things home for me. Absolutely. That's awesome. Jeanette, also, if and when we say we aren't being fed at a certain church, I think we need to ask ourselves, am I serving? Am I looking for leadership opportunities? Yeah. And I mean, I would just say this is not universal, right? Like, I think there are times where it's like a season that somebody's at a local church and it's time for them to go. Like, oh, absolutely, be blessed. I think my question for folks is not, is this other church or wherever you want to go, is it scratching all of your preference itches? My question is always, can you submit to spiritual leadership there? Because I think that is a unique aspect of the local church. But I will say, like, hey, what else are you doing? Like, oh, I attend on the weekends. Kind of all I can give right now. Okay, well, I'm just telling you, you will not find a healthy church where you go and just attend on the weekend and feel fully and finally satisfied spiritually. Because if that exists, here's what's happened. You've lowered your expectations of what it means to follow Jesus to a place that Jesus doesn't want you to lower them. Like, he wants it to take more than an hour a week. So, and then Sarah here, the minute someone tries to get all growth from someone else, or a person tries to be all sufficient, that person is being that way. Sorry to say, but that person is getting ready for a fall. And I'm out there because I can't stand to see, and I'm out of there because I can't stand to see someone fall. Well, and I think we just talked about it, right? I must decrease so that he might increase. Mm-hmm. That goes for leaders too. And so if I all of a sudden have every answer, what have I positioned myself to be in your life? I've positioned myself to be Jesus, and I'm not Jesus. And so understanding that, I think, is important. Applying that in leadership is critical. All right, so I want to look real quick as we finish up around this series of tweets. This at Besner is the Twitter handle right there. He is the pastor at Houston Northwest Church. A friend of mine sent me this, and he was basically just reflecting on why he thinks we keep seeing this. And I really appreciated some of it. I thought it might be helpful. Number one, success is celebrated more than faithfulness. And success is almost always measured by the size of the gathering. And I think, what's interesting is this, like, a lot of pastors have taken some pretty big ego hits this year. When people ask me, like, how big is Eastern Hills? I go, I don't really know. Like, I can tell you how big it was before COVID. I can tell you how many people attended. But like, I know there's a lot of people that watch online, but I don't know how many, because those metrics are funny. There's a bunch of funny math. And if that was like what you were relying on for your confidence, assuredness, man, it is just not going to help you. Like, you are going to find yourself exhausted. And what I think happens a lot is you start to compromise for this picture of success because faithfulness isn't good enough. And we say, hey, God is the one that brings harvest. We say God is the one that brings growth. But I think when success becomes more important than faithfulness, we're like, yeah, but like, I'm just gonna help him out for a minute.
And then you think, what's the first thing to go when you're celebrating success? Well, you're doing all the things to make sure you pack butts and seats, but what is the cost? Well, the way you follow Jesus is the cost.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's just this unhealthy byproduct, right? Like, something's gonna have to give. And so maybe that's, and we talked about it this weekend. Maybe that's like, you're really good on stage, but you're really bad at home. And, like Alyssa wrote me this very sweet card yesterday for Valentine's Day. And she doesn't probably know this, but like, the line that is most life-giving to me was, I love that you're the same person on stage as you are at home, as you are with friends. You're consistent. And I think, like, for me, that means a lot, just because, like, that's the kind of person I want to be. And have I arrived? Of course not. But I don't want to be this place where it's like, oh, Phil, you're incredible over here and you're totally phoning it in over here. I never want that to be the case for me. So, Anyway, Cassie, what's up? Good to see you. Glad you're with us this morning. You're not slacking at all. Glad you're with us. And then number 2, speed is celebrated more than patience. In other words, a church that blows up overnight will gain more notoriety than a church that grows a substantial ministry over years, decades, or generations. I think this is so incredibly true. I'd be curious, like for business leaders too, like Dom, if you're still on here, like this feels like it's an import from business world, right? It feels like this idea of, hey, we need to see a return on investment like we would expect a publicly traded company to return. And the idea of something's going to take, months or years or even decades, like that just feels completely antithetical to the pressures that we feel culturally right now. And I think that, it's really hard because it's like, hey, what does sustainable growth look like? What does change take place? When I got to Eastern Hills, I told the board when I was hired, hey, after somebody with as much leadership tenure as Pastor Sean has, with as gifted communication as he is, it's going to take us probably about 3 years before we really meaningfully start growing. And God was really faithful, and we grew in some ways kind of right away, but in some ways it was like this false growth, because then like we sort of plateaued at that. And then we saw some folks kind of self-select and go, I'm not ready for whatever this is. I'm going to step away. And so all of a sudden that like starts to mess with you. And you're like, hey, God, can I trust you that this is the direction you've called us to go? And that even though it's not instantly successful right now, even though it's not immediately taking root, can I trust that you're still in it? So.
Right. And I would say it's so dangerous for church leaders and churches in general when we are using the cultural model of success to measure ourselves rather than the biblical model of success, which is a slow growth over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then number 3, youth is celebrated more than age. We want to believe that there are God-ordained leaders who are going to bring the next wave of faith into the up and coming generation. And I think, I don't have a ton to say about, I think it's pretty obvious that no matter kind of where you look, it feels like the pressure to put younger and younger leaders at higher and higher places of leadership before they're ready is everywhere. And so I think what's hard about that for me is, like, I started at Eastern Hills when I was 32. And that's pretty young. That's pretty young to take on. And I think that God had prepared me as best as I could be prepared by 32. But I am a much better leader, a much closer follower of Jesus today than I was at 32. And so this idea of like, how do we make sure that we aren't injecting this idea of, hey, in order for someone to be faithful, in order for someone to be successful, in order for them to make a real difference, they have to be, let's call it sub 30. That is a wild reality in our culture. And I would say it's setting them up to fail. Right. It's setting them up for really bad habits. Because when you think about yourself in your 20s, I know young leaders do not like getting called young leaders. And I agree with Paul. Don't let people look down on you for your age. Set an example, totally on board. But you are a young leader. And there are some things in our walk with God that take time to cook. And so this idea of like, let's throw a 25-year-old out there to just communicate regularly. I'm looking for people, even younger people, that have wisdom beyond their years, that have character substance, that have had to endure hardship, because I know that stuff is coming. And if they haven't let God start to work that in them, it's going to become apparent pretty quickly. Yeah. Dom here, my experience has been that at the beginning of each year, you'd hear all about the right things, dedication to our customers that will lead to long-term growth, and that our people are our greatest resource. Let's go be great. And then usually by the end of the year, it's sacrifice the long-term to make this year's numbers, because everybody's bonuses were tied to company financial performance. Yeah, I mean, I just think there was a movement in the late 20th century to take a bunch of business practices and move them into large church philosophy. And I think, all truth is God's truth. I think there's wisdom in learning from what's happening in the marketplace, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we also shouldn't take all the bathwater either. Like, what does it look like for us to maybe be a little bit more thoughtful there? Ron, I can tell you I'm at Eastern Hills because of you, Phil, and I've questioned it for sure. Though you've proven consistent character and love for all. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I think my heart is that when folks are at Eastern Hills, it's because of Eastern Hills, right? And I'm a part of Eastern Hills, but Eastern Hills is way bigger than me. And the day that I'm there because of, and it's a single name at the end of it, guess what? I'm my own worst enemy. If I think that I can't do what Ravi did, I am living a self-deceiving life. I have to be honest about the propensities that exist in me. And I think that's the way that leaders, not only when I do that for myself, but I invite other people in my life to do that, to really know me. That when you start to hit rumble strips, when you start to hit guardrails, you got people that can raise their hands, Ben, what's up, buddy? One of my beefs with the church I grew up with was nepotism, or things that felt like it. Our pastor hardly let others preach on Sunday mornings until 2 of his sons went to seminary, and then they got to preach as 24-year-olds. Not that God can't use anyone, but it was just so obviously because they were his sons. Yeah, and it is hard. I mean, I think that is a dance to figure out. Like, if you're a pastor and you have influence and your kids feel called to ministry, you don't, like, they need to grow and slow cook too. And so what does it look like for you to make sure that you're leading them well to do that? So that's good.
There's a company in the little town that my parents live in. Happy birthday, Mom. That is family owned and operated and has been since the beginning. And one of the interesting things about it, though, is even though it is run by the family, before anyone can come and work at, it's Vermeer, before anyone from the family can come and work there, they have to go and have experience at other companies and corporations. They have to work outside of the family company and kind of almost prove themselves ready to come and then come into a role in the family company, which I think is just a great model for really anything.
Kind
of live some life and have some life experience and see then, are you really ready for what's here?
Yeah, absolutely. Dom said, I think that there's a lot to learn from corporate space, but I'd rather shop for the best they have than to offer wholesale import into the church. We have to account for the spiritual aspect of who we are as a church that isn't replicated in the corporate world. Absolutely. Right. And I was having a conversation with somebody about this recently, and we were talking about how, in a business or in an organization, typically you prioritize speed, you prioritize efficiency. But church, the metaphor is family. And so when you have something that's slowing you down, especially someone that's slowing you down in an organization, basically you just look as quickly as you can to remove that slowdown. In a family, say you have a child with specific special needs, everybody's slowing down to figure out what that child needs. You're going at the pace of the slowest person. And I think how we apply that as followers of Jesus is really, really important. We reward giftedness before we cultivate character. I've seen too many young leaders thrust into the spotlight, receiving attention and authority before they were emotionally ready. Absolutely, right? I heard a pastor years ago say, make sure that your character is always outgrowing your giftedness and your capacity. And so I think sometimes it's easy because we get all of the accolades, we get all of the celebrations when giftedness is what's growing, and character. I think it's a Carey Nieuwhof quote too. He says, giftedness will get you in the room. Character is what keeps you in the room. And I think sometimes we're so consumed, especially as young leaders, with getting in the room that we forget about what it takes to keep us in the room. And I'm just going to blow through a few of these as we wrap up here. We don't have structures built into our culture for accountability. When someone strays away, we often extend grace instead of leaning into conflict and confronting what needs to be exposed. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Emotional health isn't usually emphasized in training or in professional development. Consequently, we often end up with unintentionally perpetuating unhealthy mindsets, emotional responses within the church. I'm in counseling now. I've had great counseling experience in my adult life. Very, very thankful for that. But this was the conversations I'm having now about managing stress and my own journey with Jesus in the midst of ministry. These would have been really helpful conversations as a 20-year-old in undergrad or as a 23-year-old in grad school, but they were nowhere to be found. And so what does it look like to incorporate the need for emotional care, for true spiritual direction at an individual level much earlier in the process, for sure.
And I would say to acknowledge that emotional health and well-being is a part of our journey. it's not something that we can kind of avoid and ignore, or shouldn't.
Yeah, we definitely should not. I mean, it would be at our own peril for sure. And then number 7, charisma and confidence are almost always allowed to gloss over character flaws because our model works best when a charismatic and confident individual is placed in front of the room. If not held accountable, the cycle can quickly and harmfully perpetuate itself. Absolutely. And I would say most of the time, I was listening to a podcast recently by a guy named Dan Allender, who founded a school up in Seattle. And he was talking about how prominent it is for really charismatic narcissists to lead churches. And it's because there's like really good things that come with that, but there are like some really dark shadows. And if there's nothing else, like not only do you have that, but it's also what your system is creating. And so that is not a healthy place to be. And then number 8, economics are a reality. No one likes to talk about this, but it's true. We can sometimes gloss over character with a charismatic leader because he or she puts butts in seats, and that translates into dollars. And I mean, I think the church in general is going to have to grapple with this a little bit. Like, do we believe that the dollars that God provides are the dollars that we're supposed to function with and stay faithful? Or are we going to chase some dollar amount that we have in our head that maybe God never gave us? And, you know, God's been tremendously faithful to Eastern Hills for many, many years, including this one. But I remember when I got here, every year the pattern had been, here's the growth we're going to assume financially over the next year. And it puts you behind the 8 ball immediately. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, what if we just started next year with the assumption that God would provide what he provided this year? And if we grow, that's healthy margin. And if we don't financially grow, we're not immediately behind the 8 ball. And it immediately allowed us to start thinking and understanding finances differently. So just a thing to think about. We got some application to catch up on here. Crystal said, my application for today, when I hit hardships, who are the people I surround myself with that will support me, keep me accountable, and on the straight and narrow? Absolutely. Who are the people that are safe people for you? That's what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks too. The people that will really genuinely sit in it with you and won't immediately jump to judgment, won't immediately jump to blaming. Even if there's some stuff that you need to take accountability for, here's what I'll tell you. I know that, like, when I'm in a difficult place, when I've blown it, when I've responded in a way I shouldn't, and I have good friends that love me and we like hang out and we're talking and they're processing and they're going to tell me more about that, I'm going to say, I know this. I know I need to do this. I know I need to do this differently. I know I need to apologize. I don't need them to give me that information. I just need a safe person to help me process the experience. Most of the time, that will be the case. Eileen, the sad thing is similar to what we're learning about in the world religions series, is where the truth is distorted. Even I know it, and it is replaced by lies. It is so easily to be led astray. And one of those lies is a need to shame anyone who has a moral failure or who is part of moral failure. I'm not saying we encourage it, but the church, it just moved on me. But the church is a place of broken people. And according to scripture, we have moral failures. So it makes me sad that the place which should be a safe place to admit what is really happening so we can work on it together is the very last place people want to share. If I expect my church to be a place of perfect people, then I'm expecting a big social club. If I expect my church to be a hospital full of sick people, including myself, then when someone tells me they're sick, I can say, guess what? I am too. Let's work toward healing in Jesus. In a war, a good strategy is to take down the leaders and scatter the soldiers. But I'm a soldier that is following Jesus only and keeps my eyes on him. Then I can't be scattered because I will never lose him. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely, absolutely true. And I do think there is this sense in which for all of us, we have to acknowledge that we're not perfect. And if whatever church you're a part of, Eastern Hills or another one, if you have not disagreed with your pastor in a long time, it might be another good reason to think about leaving. Like, we have to be challenging one another. We have to be getting stretched. If somebody hasn't said to you, because here's the thing I just see, I'll just be honest with you. The thing that is exhausting to me is the level of unchecked, over the top, awful gossip and slander that takes place in churches. and people will create a huge windstorm from it, and then they just peace out, and they're like, aha, sorry, I just lit a match and ran. And I think even for followers of Jesus to say to one another, hey, either have that conversation with the person, bring in a church leader to help have the conversation, or stop talking, because what you're doing is not helping anyone. Paul says that kind of talk, it spreads like gangrene. It's a disease. And what I see all the time, even in this last year, is people that start the disease and then walk away. And they will never know how much damage they've done to people that they say they care about, because they did something that, well, they have plenty of justification for. They are living and functioning in sin with, rather than letting people in their life speak truth to them. So just got a little.
Well, and with that, I would also say pedestal pastoring is not good for the people, and it's not good for the pastor. And so what I mean by that is, when we are holding someone up to this on this pedestal, thinking, oh, they're perfect, oh, they don't make mistakes, oh, they're kind of above all of this, it's harmful to that person, because it can go one of two ways, right? They can start to think that, well, I can't admit my sin because people think that I don't.
Right.
Or it makes people feel like I can't admit my sin because perfect pastor on the pedestal doesn't. And so it just creates this really, really dangerous place for everyone. So that's why Phil and I talk all the time, like, we're not perfect.
Right.
We sin. Like, I'm a terrible mom. Like, there are just things in my life that I just can't quite get a grip on. And that's why I need Jesus. That's why I need his forgiveness and his grace and his mercy every single day. Same thing with Phil. Like, Phil's a great dad. He's not perfect. And so, how can we give each other grace in that? And remember, we're all struggling with something. We're all on this journey together. And God put us in these places on purpose, with purpose, my thing. But we're not perfect.
Well, and you're not a terrible mom, right? But that's the way you feel, because
Right.
you feel this pressure to be perfect. We all feel this pressure to be perfect. And when we can't be honest about what's going on, right? When we can't be honest about the hurts that we've caused and the hurts that have been caused to us, it perpetuates that wrong thinking. So let's see here. Tina, personally, I feel like technology has been amazing to the church itself. That being said, I feel like it's kind of a detriment to the church family. It's very easy to say, I'll pray for you, you're in my prayers, then go on with your life, when you're not looking at the loss and sadness in their eyes. Absolutely. And I'll just tell you, for folks that have come back and physically gathered in person, I mean, this weekend was crazy bad weather. And I was like, are you gonna have like 4 people? And we had like a pretty reasonable amount of people at all of our services. And people who were, it was there. We always have first timers in all of this, which blows my mind. A guy that had just become a Christian, and the thing over and over again that you'll hear is, even just being in a service, being able to talk to people, they're like, man, I'm so glad that online exists, but it is just not the same. And I think we're made for more than screens. We're going to talk about that over the next couple of weeks. I'm thankful that they exist. I'm thankful they're not the only thing that exists. Dom, application, what do I need to do to remind myself that regardless of great success or not, my identity is rooted in Jesus, and I am always his kid, nothing more, nothing less. Absolutely. That is maybe the most insidious part of being a pastor, that if you allow it to become your identity, that will take you down faster than anything else. And I will sometimes fantasize about a life not in ministry to remind myself I'd still be following Jesus. He would still love me. I would still be able to love my family well. Being a pastor is a part of who I am, and it's what I do, but it is not my identity. And then Debbie, what's up? Who are the people that will speak truth into my life, not just make me feel better? Absolutely. And I think, like, I almost ask myself too, like, who have I given permission to in my life to say things I don't want to hear? That I'll like listen to that. I can tell you there are people in my life that if they were like, hey, Phil, you need to know this. Like, I need you to know this. I need you to hear this. And I'm like, okay, like, I'm going to take your word for it, because I have that trust, because we have that relationship. Who are those people in your life? And then Cassie, do not push the my church mindset onto people. If they have found a church that they like and fit in well with, don't try to get them to feel things from eHills that they already feel elsewhere. And sometimes if someone does this to you, discuss it and focus on emotional, mental health as much as physical health. Yeah. And I would say, our heart as a church is, yeah, we know that there are going to be people that move into our area. We know there are people that get sideways with the church and come be a part of ours. And I always have that question. I ask the question, are you new to the area? Or are you just new to Eastern Hills? And I want to know, like, hey, did you come from somewhere else? What happened? Because the thing that made you mad over there, we might be doing the same thing. Like, just because you like the lights that we have and how I talk from the platform, like that's not our whole church. And so I think that's important. And really our mission of like, what does it look like for Eastern Hills to grow in a healthy way is to not just grab people from other churches. It's that people who are close to us physically, but far from the relationship that God died to provide in your neighborhood, in your workplace, that they would find and follow Jesus at Eastern Hills. That for us is core to what it means to be successful for our community. And then Ron, my 2 daughters were there this week. I'm ready to come back in person. I miss it. That's awesome. That's really good. Well, guys, really appreciate you engaging. I know this is a little bit of a pivot. Tomorrow, we're going to start a series that we'll do for the rest of the week on Samson. And so I think that'll be a cool opportunity to just dig into some text in a more normal way. But thanks for allowing us to kind of have this conversation and just be able to say, you know what, we need to keep talking about this. Mm-hmm. This can't just be something that blows by. We need to grieve for these victims that continue to get created, not just out of Ravi Zacharias, but out of the church in general. I think it was Eileen that said, like, we should be the safest place. We should be the safest place for people to be honest. We should be the safest place for people to come forward with their hurts and hangups. And when we bury this stuff at the leadership level, we create cultures in which we bury it everywhere else too. And we do not want to be that kind of community.
And I would say we had planned on doing Samson this week just out of, I don't know, I just thought it would be fun to do, kind of easing back in. But I think it'll be great to take this conversation into the rest of the week and kind of look at where do we see Samson not applying these healthy boundaries for himself, and what kind of destruction does that lead to in his life?
Absolutely. Jenny, I'm raising my hand. This is a huge lesson and discussion we have had in my home, and it started with Will's job. After relocating 9 times and the commitment with that, Carl Grill became our identity. I think I'm reading that right. Cargill. When it fell on one day, it was devastating. We now always say that it is not who we are. We are followers first. It prioritizes everything, right? I mean, that's what Jesus said. Seek first his kingdom, his righteousness. Everything else will figure itself out, right? That's essentially Matthew 6:33. My head may drop off as I'm nodding so hard. That's awesome. And then David, I think it may have been your first message where you said you pray kneeling to remind your heart that you're not the guy. You're just a guy. Yep. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. So we had a new sound guy this weekend, and he was like a contractor. And he was like, "Oh, you're the head pastor?" And I was like, "I'm Phil. Like I'm comfortable with everything to do with what you did. I'm just Phil. Nice to see you." All right. Well, I'm going to pray for us. Thank you so much. Thanks again to Crystal for keeping us all squared away here in this document. If you have any prayer requests, feel free to drop those in. I'll be praying for them over the next day, and we'll be back tomorrow. But before we go, let me pray for us and let you go on with your day. God, thank you so much. Thank you for this community. Thank you that Lisa and I have a place that who we are is going to ooze out anyway. Like, we can't talk for this many hours every single day when we're tired, when we're discouraged, when things are going well, when things are going poorly, without some real in the midst of that. So thank you for the gift of this group that allows us to do that, and to show a group of people who we really are, and you, God, that we're not perfect, but we're trying to follow you closer every day. We're trying to abide in you. Thanks for the gift that we get to do this, not just on a weekend, not just with a message, but every day learning to follow you, abide in you. Would you help us do that? Would you help us be a community of followers that do that? Would you help me as a leader, God, to set the tone for what it means to be honest about what's going on in my life, that this is not an area where I've arrived. I'm not perfect, but that I'm on the same journey of learning to follow you too. God, would you help us to do that well today? Would you be with our relationships and all the different opportunities we have? It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it. Have an amazing day. We will see you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m.